A man takes another man's wife, not in secret, not in shame, but in front of him, at a formal dinner, with witnesses, like it's part of the entertainment. She is led out of the room and he must stay. He hears her screams from behind a curtain. No one moves. No one speaks, not even her husband, because the man taking her is the Emperor of Rome. You think you know what depravity is? You've seen the movies. You've heard the stories. Roman orgies, sensual feasts, scandalous affairs. But what if I told you all of that? Everything you've imagined was a lie of omission. A watered-down version of horror so disturbing, Roman historians buried them under euphemism, irony, and coded Latin. Today we're going deeper, not into myth, not into rumor, but into documented history. From imperial records, ancient authors, and ruins, still marked by the scars of ritualized trauma. If you enjoy learning about the hidden darkness behind great empires, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. It helps us bring more uncomfortable truths like this to light. Because this isn't about sex, it's about power, about how desire became a weapon. How one empire transformed sexuality into a political tool, not to seduce, but to destroy. Our story begins in the banquet halls of Emperor Caligula, a man whose name became shorthand for madness, but whose genius lay in understanding a far deeper kind of control, the kind that doesn't kill the body, but fractures the soul. And what you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's recorded by Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny, the Elder, and Juvenal. Roman men writing about their own society, their own emperors, their own complicity. Let's begin. It always began the same way, with an invitation. But in imperial Rome, an invitation from Caligula wasn't really an invitation. It was a command dressed in gold leaf and silken thread. Declining meant treason, attending meant submission. The year was 38 CE. Rome stood at the height of its power. Its legions stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, its palaces gleaming with marble and blood. Inside one of those palaces, a dinner was being prepared, not for celebration, not for diplomacy, but for domination. The guests were Rome's most powerful men, senators, generals, magistrates, each accompanied by his wife, veiled and perfumed, her face painted with care. They entered the hall beneath vaulted ceilings, past bronze statues of gods who no longer answered prayers. Everything sparkled. Wine goblets of crystal, fountains laced with rose oil, dishes glazed with saffron and honey. Servants moved like ghosts, trained never to make eye contact. But none of this distracted from the real atmosphere. Fear, because they all knew what was coming. Caligula did not keep his guests waiting. He entered without ceremony, young, barely dressed in white robes that shimmered with gold embroidery. His eyes were sharp, gleaming with a cold, boyish cruelty. He did not sit. He walked the length of the table. He ignored the men. He looked at their wives. He paused behind one woman, then another. He ran his fingers along his shoulder, tucked a strand of hair behind an ear, touched the curve of a jaw. He asked no questions, issued no greetings. A husband cleared his throat, too loud. Caligula turned, raised one eyebrow. The man shrank, his face already sweating. Caligula smirked. Then, casually, he made his choice. He took the woman by the hand, led her out of the room. Ow! The guests stayed seated. No one moved. No one dared. Behind the silk curtain there was laughter, then silence, then a low, rhythmic sound, then a muffled sob. It lasted minutes. When Caligula returned, he looked refreshed. He took his place at the head of the table, picked up a fig, and began speaking. Not about politics, not about war. He spoke about her scent, her cries, how long it took before she stopped resisting, how she compared to her husband's reputation. He described the way her eyes looked when she realized what was happening would not stop. He smiled as he spoke. The husband did not. He stared at the table, his fists clenched, but he said nothing. Because if he said anything at all, his body would be floating in the Tiber by morning. And that was exactly the point. This was not lust. This was strategy. Caligula wasn't abusing women for pleasure. He was breaking men. He understood something most rulers never did, that physical death is easy, it ends resistance. But psychological death, humiliation, emasculation, the erasure of pride and power that lasts, that corrodes, that ensures silence. He repeated this process at nearly every banquet. According to Suetonius, Caligula developed entire protocols for his assaults. Palace slaves were assigned to record which wives had been chosen, which ones cried, which ones fought, which ones went limp. Each act was written down, catalogued, stored. The bureaucracy of rape had become an extension of the imperial administration, and still they kept coming. The senators, the noblemen, the generals. They dressed in their best to sit quietly while their wives were evaluated like cattle, because refusal meant death. But attendance meant something far worse, complicity. You may think in the modern world, how could anyone endure this? But Rome was not modern. Rome was survival. Survival meant submission. One of the most infamous moments came not at a dinner, but at a wedding. The bride was Livia Orestilla, a noblewoman of radiant beauty. Her husband Tubi, Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a respected noble and future conspirator. The wedding was lavish. Garlands of purple, musicians playing soft lyre music, family members dressed in embroidered linen, and then Caligula arrived, uninvited, unannounced. He walked straight to the couple, raised his arms like an actor on stage. "I will take this bride," he declared, in the ancient tradition of Romulus. The room went still. Everyone understood the reference. The rape of the Sabine women, Rome's founding myth, where Romulus and his men abducted and raped the women of a neighboring tribe to populate their new city. Caligula was not alluding to myth. He was reenacting it. He led Livia away, mid-ceremony, while her new husband stood frozen in place. The guests bowed their heads. The music stopped. No one followed. Later, Caligula announced she was no longer of interest. He had used her, defiled her, discarded her, and Piso. He did nothing because he could do nothing. He lived on, a ghost in his own life, a husband without a wife, a man stripped of manhood without a blade. These scenes weren't isolated. They were the system. In the words of Tacitus, Caligula's rule was marked not by sudden bursts of madness, but by a cold, strategic descent into tyranny. His cruelty wasn't blind, it was directed, sharp, surgical. He turned every nobleman into a hollow shell, every wife into a message. I own you. I own your family. I own your body. The humiliation was layered. Caligula didn't just violate women. He forced men to witness it. He turned husbands into bystanders, fathers into spectators. He transformed intimate violence into political theater. The trauma was multidirectional. The women endured physical and emotional violation. The men suffered psychological collapse, emasculation so profound that many never recovered. Some committed suicide. Others resigned from public life. A few plotted revenge, though few lived to attempt it. But the cruelty wasn't complete until it was recorded. Palace scribes documented every act, like accountants, like priests, names, dates, details. Imperial Rome had turned rape into ritual, and ritual into governance. This is how power operated in Caligula's court, not with laws or swords, but with shame as currency. And the horror was systemic. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't whispered. It was the architecture of the regime. One senator reportedly kept a dagger hidden under his tunic for weeks, hoping for a chance to kill the emperor. He never found it, because fear keeps the hand from moving. And so it continued. Banquet after banquet, ceremony after ceremony. The empire's elite seated in golden chairs, sipping poisoned wine, while their dignity was torn from them in slow, deliberate pieces. In Caligula, he smiled through it all. To history, he is remembered as mad. But madness implies chaos. What history rarely admits, because it is harder to bear, is that he knew exactly what he was doing. And he built his empire on the broken backs of men who knew that silence was the only way to survive. The island was beautiful. That's what made it worse. Capri, with its jagged cliffs and sapphire waters, seemed carved by the gods themselves. From a distance, it was paradise. But inside the imperial villas, perched high above the sea, something else was happening. Something that still stains the history of Rome. This was where Emperor Tiberius disappeared to in the final years of his rule. He called it a retreat. The official story claimed he was escaping the noise and politics of the capital, but Suetonius, Tacitus, and Dio Cassius tell another story, one filled with pain, power, and perversion. Tiberius wasn't retreating. He was constructing a laboratory for sexual experimentation. At first, he brought only a few attendants, then builders, then artists, then slaves, then boys, then girls. Some were taken under the guise of service to the emperor. Others were gifts from senators hoping to curry favor. Some were simply abducted. Their families were either compensated or silenced. Once they arrived, there was no leaving. The architecture itself was designed for voyeurism. Hidden passageways, viewing chambers, rooms with glass floors. Frescoes depicting sexual acts adorned the walls, not as decoration but as instruction. Tiberius had no interest in seduction. He sought control, precision, variety. According to Suetonius, the emperor stocked his villas with manuals, Greek texts on sexual technique, ancient books of anatomy, and sketches to guide performance. He employed slaves not to please, but to perfect. Servants were trained to orchestrate entire scenes with timing and stagecraft. These were not orgies, they were productions, and the actors were not volunteers. Many of them were children. They were not called victims, they were called ministers of pleasure. Some were as young as 8, chosen for their appearance, trained to serve, often renamed, stripped of identity, taught how to smile on cue, how to pretend they were not afraid, how to perform without crying. Some could not. They were discarded, or worse, punished, not for disobedience, but for disrupting the illusion of harmony. The emperor was rarely touched himself. He preferred to observe, to direct, to control every detail. And when he did engage, it was often violent, not in a frenzy, but with clinical curiosity. What happened if this? What would they do if that? The island became a place where the normal rules of Roman life simply didn't apply. Tiberius had removed himself from the Senate, the streets, and the scrutiny. Capri was his canvas, and human beings were his materials. The psychological damage was unspeakable. Some of the boys tried to run. They were caught, beaten, and displayed as warnings. Others jumped from the cliffs into the sea. Their bodies were found days later, bloated and broken. But most adapted, or rather dissociated. They stopped resisting. They became shells. They laughed when asked. They smiled when ordered. They obeyed without flinching. Survival meant surrender. One story, preserved in ancient texts, tells of a boy who refused to perform. Tiberius had him stripped, tied to a marble pedestal, and whipped, not out of anger, but to observe the effects. The boy bit through his tongue. He did not scream. He passed out from the pain. Tiberius applauded his endurance, then had him fed and returned to training. This was the level of depravity at play. Medical slaves were employed not to heal but to preserve, to keep the victims alive for the next session, to apply ointment to torn skin, to reduce fever, to drain infections, to silence trauma with poppy syrup and soft words that meant nothing. There were ledgers for this, procurement costs, food rations, schedules of performance, compensation to families, sometimes even burial expenses. Rome funded it all. The senators knew, the imperial court knew. But Capri was far, and Tiberius was emperor. To question him was to vanish. The darkness spread quietly. Some noble families began offering their children willingly. It brought privilege, status, political advancement. A child sent to Capri might return with favor, or not return at all. But the gamble was worth it for families hungry for power. We call that complicity. Tiberius himself seemed to evolve, or descend, into something almost unrecognizable. Tacitus writes of his increasing paranoia, his mistrust of friends, his obsession with omens. But on Capri, surrounded by silence, he found control. He was never questioned, never denied. Everything he wanted was given. Everyone he touched belonged to him. And that is the true horror. Not that these acts happened, but that they were normalized, systematized, perfected. This was not madness. Madness would have been chaos. Tiberius was methodical. He created a culture with rules, roles, and rituals. A hidden empire within an empire, where Roman law did not exist, only imperial desire. The villas on Capri still stand. Tourists visit them now, snapping photos of ruins. But look closely at the floor plans. You'll find walls with holes cut for observation. You'll find rooms without windows, with drains carved into the stone. You'll find frescoes not of gods and heroes, but of acts you won't see in museums. The architecture still whispers the truth. This wasn't a retreat. It was a prison built for spectacle. And the emperor was both the warden and the audience. History tries to soften this, to call it eccentricity, isolation, grief. But the documents remain. The ruins remain. The accounts buried in the footnotes of Roman historians are still there. Tiberius ruled for 23 years. For 11 of them, Capri was his stage, and thousands were forced to perform. What does it mean when an empire can sustain this? What does it say about Rome when its people allow this to happen because they feared losing favor, losing access, losing life? And what does it say about us when we forget it? She was married to the most powerful man in the empire, and yet at night she slipped out of the palace like a fugitive, wrapped in cheap wool. Her hair covered in a prostitute's wig, her name left behind. Valeria Messalina, third wife of Emperor. Claudius is remembered as one of the most dangerous women in Roman history, not because she held armies, not because she commanded legions, but because she understood the currency of Rome: sex, shame, and spectacle. She didn't just break the rules of Roman womanhood, she rewrote them. From the outside, she was the perfect matron. Regal, composed, fertile, bearing to children for the imperial bloodline. Her statues were carved with downcast eyes and modest drapery, honoring the Roman virtues of chastity and domesticity. But those who served in the palace knew better. Behind the golden doors of Domus Claudia, the empress was building a kingdom of her own, a kingdom of appetite. It started with whispers. Palace guards reported strange nighttime movements. A woman leaving through the servants' corridor, a horse waiting without herald. And in the shadows of Rome, in the stink of its lower quarters, the whispers followed. A mysterious prostitute with noble speech, delicate hands, and imperial perfume. According to Juvenal, this prostitute went by the name Chevalfe. She worked in one of the most degraded brothels near the Esquiline Cemetery. She took clients all night. She never turned anyone away. And when the sun began to rise, she returned to the palace. Why would an empress debase herself like this? Was it addiction, masochism, or was it something far more calculated? Messalina was not a passive woman. She was strategic, observant. Raised in the inner circles of power, descended from Mark Antony, niece of Augustus's favored wife, knew what Rome revered on, what it feared, and she used both. She transformed sex into domination, not just over men, but over class, over law, over the very structure of Roman morality. While Roman matrons were expected to be modest, restrained, silent in public, Messalina laughed loudly, dressed extravagantly, took lovers with abandon. She did not hide. She dared Rome to challenge her. And when they didn't, she pushed further. According to Pliny the Elder, one night Messalina summoned Silitha, most famous courtesan in the city. It's the kind of woman noblemen visited in disguise. She challenged her to a sexual endurance contest. They would see who could take more lovers in a single night. The scene, an imperial villa draped in silks, floors scented with crushed flowers, no privacy. There were judges, servants, witnesses, even a scribe to record the count. The men came one after the other. By dawn, Scylla collapsed, exhausted. Messalina did not. She kept going. 25 men. That's the number Pliny records. 25 men in one night. An empress of Rome, using her body like a weapon to annihilate comparison. She was not proving sexual superiority. She was proving political immunity. No other woman in Rome, slave or free, could survive such an act and remain in public life. But Messalina thrived on it. And yet, these were not just private indulgences. Behind the sexual theater was a campaign of control. She wielded her body like a general wields troops. Messalina arranged for her lovers to receive government positions. She replaced senators, exiled officials, framed wives. A man who pleased her in bed could become consul within weeks. Even the emperor seemed oblivious. Claudius, scholarly and withdrawn, spent his time with scrolls and speeches, trusting his wife to manage domestic matters. Amselina's ambitions grew bolder. Her final lover, Gaius Silius, was not just another man. Oh, he was dangerous, young, handsome, politically connected, and, unlike the others, he loved her back. Messalina began appearing in public with him, whispering at feasts, hosting private dinners where Claudius was excluded. And then, in a move that crossed from scandal into treason, she arranged a wedding. Not in secret. Not as a metaphor. A full ceremony. Priests, vows, witnesses, music. While Claudius was out of the city, attending religious rites in Ostia, Messalina married Silius as if Claudius were already dead. And during the wedding feast, she and Silius consummated the union publicly, in view of guests, on a bed of imported silk and ivory. This wasn't lust. It was a performance of succession. Messalina wasn't just challenging social norms anymore. She was testing the boundaries of imperial power. Could the empress replace the emperor? Could Rome survive a woman who chose her own husband? For the first time, her enemies moved. Narcissus, Claudius's trusted freedman, informed the emperor of the betrayal. At first, Claudius didn't believe it. His own wife, with another man, married in public? The shock immobilized him. But then the scrolls came. Witnesses were brought. Messalina's marriage contract was laid on the table. Narcissus acted swiftly. He bypassed Claudius's hesitation and sent orders to the Praetorian Guard. Messalina fled. She ran to the gardens of Lucullus's estate, once filled with music and luxury, now a prison of ivy and silence. There, she waited, tried to write letters, begged for an audience with her husband. Claudius refused to see her. The guards arrived. When the soldier raised his sword, he hesitated. She was still the empress, still young, still beautiful. But Messalina did not beg. She took the blade and tried to kill herself. She failed. She was too weak. The soldier finished the job. She died not with a scream, but with a silence that haunted Rome. Claudius never spoke her name again. Her statues were torn down. Her face was scratched off coins. Her children were removed from public life. History tried to forget her. But Rome could not, because Messalina had revealed something it could never unsee. That one woman had pierced the illusion of order. That beneath the marble, behind the Latin, under the law, Rome was still ruled by those who understood how to manipulate desire, and no one had done it better than her. Was she evil, insane, or was she simply what Rome made her? A creature forged in a society where women were bred to be silent but watched constantly, where sex was shameful but everywhere, where power was inherited by men but held in the bodies of women. She had turned the hypocrisy inside out. She had paid the price, not with infamy, but with erasure, because Messalina's true crime wasn't sex. It was daring to believe she could use it the way men always had dared win. They were the most celebrated men in Rome. They fought under the sun in the Colosseum, drenched in blood and glory. Crowds roared their names. Poets wrote verses about their strength. Children carved their faces into wax tablets. Women clutched their images as charms. But in private, when the sand was swept away and the crowds dispersed, the truth returned. Gladiators were slaves. And in Rome, slaves could be touched, used, owned in every sense of the word. Fame did not protect them. If anything, it made them more desirable. Rich women would line the corridors beneath the arena, not to congratulate the champions, but to purchase them like livestock at a festival, like toys for a night. Senators' wives, merchant widows, even priestesses in disguise. They came with veils and coin purses, eager to taste the blood-slicked bodies of men who had killed just hours before. Some gladiators resisted, but there was no such thing as refusal. You did not say no when a woman with wealth and influence selected you. You didn't even speak. You obeyed, or you vanished. Roman law was clear. A gladiator, even a famed one, had no bodily autonomy. He was both spectacle and property, could be worshipped in the arena, then raped in private, and the law would protect the rapist, not the victim. It created a psychological fracture. They lived as heroes by day and as objects by night. Some were forced to perform before groups in private chambers after feasts. The same crowd that had cheered their combat would gather again, this time behind silk curtains to watch their bodies used like stage props. Others were released for extended periods, sent to wealthy estates, not to train, not to rest, but to serve as sexual slaves in chains. One noble woman reportedly kept a young Thracian gladiator for months, boasting that he was better than her husband and more obedient than her dog. There was no dignity in these exchanges, only cold transaction. And worse, some gladiators were ordered to impregnate slaves in breeding programs. Their seed was seen as valuable. A child born from a famed fighter was considered worth gold on the market. They were not asked if they wanted to become fathers. They were used like stallions. Their name rarely passed to the child. And if a gladiator formed a bond, if he fell in love with a fellow slave, a servant girl, or even another fighter, it was broken, purposefully, because intimacy humanized. And Rome didn't want human gladiators. They wanted weapons with faces. It's those who resisted, who tried to escape, who fought their masters in private, were punished not just with death, but with humiliation. One story tells of a famed retiarius who refused to satisfy the wife of a high-ranking consul. He was stripped naked, bound to a post in the arena not to fight, but to be mocked and whipped in front of the crowd. His body was carved with insults. Then he was killed not with swords, but slowly with burns and blades, while his audience drank and laughed. He had been a hero. He died as a warning. Others took their own lives before being summoned to private chambers. One Murmillo, after a victorious bout, was escorted to a senator's villa. That night, he slit his throat in the bathing room. The senator complained not about the death, but about the stain left on the marble. These stories were not isolated. They were part of a pattern, a system. Gladiators were both idolized and destroyed, desired and degraded. They lived under constant surveillance, their bodies sculpted not just for battle, but for pleasure. And their suffering was never acknowledged, because Rome loved duality. It loved the idea that a man could be both god and slave, that a figure celebrated by the masses could be privately violated, and still return to the arena with a smile painted across his bruised face. This cognitive dissonance wasn't accidental. It was a feature of control. It reminded the public that no one, not even the strongest, was safe, that even in glory you could be owned, that Rome's power reached into your skin, your bed, your soul, and it broke them, not always physically, but slowly, quietly, in the way they stopped looking people in the eye, in the way they flinched at applause, in the way their bodies obeyed commands even before the words were spoken. Gladiators weren't just killed in the arena. They were destroyed long before they bled. And when they died, their names were etched onto tombs or left to fade in slave registers. The women who used them forgot them. But in those final moments, as they faced sword or spear, some of them may have found a strange comfort, because death, clean, public, and final, was the only moment they truly belonged to themselves. It wasn't just the bedrooms. It wasn't just the palaces or the brothels or the island of Capri. In Rome, sexual domination didn't hide in the shadows. It was sanctified in temples, carved into public walls, paraded in festivals. The Romans did not separate religion from desire. They sacralized sex, elevating it beyond pleasure and turning it into something even more powerful, a tool of divine order, civic ritual, and cultural identity. And nowhere was this more visible than in the worship of Priapus. Priapus was not a god of love or beauty. He was grotesque, a minor deity with an enormous, perpetually erect phallus, so large that his statues required architectural support. He stood in gardens, at crossroads, in fields, not to be admired, but to be feared. His image warded off evil not with holiness, but with sexual threats. In homes, statues of Priapus were placed near the door. Some held knives. Others carried inscriptions like, "Touch the fruit, and this will be thrust into you." And this wasn't metaphor. It was a warning. Violate my property, and you will be raped by the divine. It revealed something chilling about Roman values. The gods didn't just punish. They didn't just protect. they violated with approval. The phallus was not merely a symbolite, it was a weapon sanctified by heaven. But it didn't stop with Priapus. Every February, Romans celebrated Lupercalia, a fertility festival so brutal that even later emperors tried and failed to suppress it. Young men from noble families, stripped naked, sometimes wearing only goat skins, ran through the streets of Rome, whipping women with leather thongs cut from sacrificed animals. The women would line the roads, arms outstretched, backs bare, welcoming the lashes. They believed the blows would increase fertility. The whipping wasn't symbolic. It was aggressive, sexual, sometimes drawing blood. And yet it was not condemned. It was tradition. Historians like Plutarch describe the festival with detached amusement. But under the description lies a terrifying truth. Violence was not only accepted, it was liturgical. Religion did not protect the vulnerable. It organized their exposure. And then there were the temples. The city of Pompeii, buried by Vesuvius, in 79 C, archaeologists uncovered entire buildings dedicated to sacred sex. Walls painted with couples engaged in every imaginable position. Priests and priestesses trained not in scripture, but in touch, in rhythm, in performance. The Temple of Venus wasn't just a place of prayer. It was a site of transaction. Offerings were made not with incense, but with flesh. Sex was offered for blessings, purchased for protection, sold for survival. The line between religion and prostitution vanished, and sometimes so did the line between sex and death. At the city cemeteries, another market flourished. Graveyard prostitutes, women too poor, too old, or too damaged to work in brothels, offered their bodies next to tombs. Men came to them not for pleasure, but for a different sensation, proximity to death. There, amid the stone coffins and funeral urns, Roman men paid to violate women beside the dead. Why, some claimed it was a way to commune with spirits. Others believed sex near the dead heightened eroticism. But in truth, it was a form of psychosexual power, a way to own the space between life and oblivion. The women didn't scream. They couldn't. Screaming drew attention. That attention brought punishment. They were called nocturni, night women. They weren't alone. Men also sold themselves, often former slaves, some blind, some mutilated, offering silent service to those who craved both control and anonymity. Rome had no need to hide its hunger. In fact, it celebrated it in stone. Everywhere you turned, sex stared back at you, on door knockers shaped like erect penises, on children's amulets bearing images of copulation, in bakeries where frescoes showed threesomes in between loaves of bread and bowls of fruit. Sex wasn't separate from daily life. It was part of everything. To modern minds, it might seem like liberation. But for the victims, those forced into rituals, performances, or offerings, it was anything but. It was a culture of exposure, of consumption, of normalized desecration. Even Roman marriage, the supposed cornerstone of morality, offered little protection. A woman could be paraded naked at her wedding if tradition called for it. A slave could be sexually inspected before being gifted to his son-in-law. A temple virgin could be buried alive if found impure. Piety didn't save you. If anything, it made you easier to sacrifice. Rome's religious system gave spiritual legitimacy to acts that, in any other context, would be crimes. And once you bless cruelty in the name of the gods, you create a society without boundaries. A world where brutality is not just permitted but divinely endorsed. We remember Rome for its triumphs, its roads, its architecture, its laws. But we forget what lived beneath the stone. Not just cruelty, but structure. Not just perversion, policy. Because what we've explored in this story, from Caligula's dinner table humiliations, to Tiberius's sexual laboratory on Capri, to Messalina's weaponized self-degradation, to the public consumption of gladiators, and finally to religious rituals soaked in erotic violence, was not random. It was systemic, institutional, endorsed not only by emperors, but by culture, by silence, by convenience. This wasn't the Rome of Hollywood filled with noble senators and doomed lovers. This was a Rome where power was measured not only by land or gold or military rank, but by what you could do to another human being and get away with it. And they got away with a lot, because the true machinery of an empire isn't built on ideals. It's built on what people are willing to overlook. So long as the aqueducts flowed, so long as the markets were stocked, so long as the poor had bread and the rich had slaves. The engine continued to turn, and beneath that engine bodies, some broken in the Colosseum, others broken in bedrooms, some used in rituals that blurred the line between belief and brutality. Some never even recorded. Historians try to separate it, to place these horrors in a box labeled excess, madness, decay. But these weren't glitches in the system, or the system. The bureaucracies that scheduled dinner parties also scheduled assaults. The temples that taught virtue also trained sacred servants. The women who were empresses could also be prostitutes. The men who were warriors could also be slaves. Rome didn't just tolerate contradictions. It built its identity on them. The same empire that gave us legal codes and civil engineering also normalized rape as ritual. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Because once you recognize that, the next question becomes inescapable. What are we normalizing today? Because it's efficient, because it's hidden, because it benefits the powerful. That's not just a historical question, that's a warning. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it echoes. And sometimes it screams. This is why we tell these stories, not to gawk, not to sensationalize, but to remember, to reckon, to expose the shadows cast by marble monuments. Because you cannot understand civilization without understanding what it's willing to excuse. And Rome glorious, mighty Romix, accused everything. If you've made it this far, thank you. These are not easy truths to sit with, but they're necessary. Please comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you found this story meaningful, subscribe. We bring more forgotten histories like this to light every week. Not the clean versions, but the real ones.